Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Dogwhistles and Figleaves, How Manipulative Language Spreads Racism and Falsehood, by Jennifer Mather Saul, read by Clare Staniforth. Introduction. Trump's 2016 presidential victory revealed some quite obvious divisions in the United States between those who loved his crass racism and sexism and those who hated it, for example. But even among his opponents, there were divisions that his win laid bare. One of these is brilliantly illustrated by a Saturday Night Live sketch showing a group of anti-Trump voters watching election returns at a party. The white viewers find his victory unimaginable, while the black viewers clearly expected precisely this. The white viewers are shocked and horrified by the fact that racism still exists. The black viewers shake their heads in bemusement at the white voters' ignorance and lack of self-knowledge. The received wisdom in political psychology would have predicted much of this, that many white Americans would be blissfully unaware that Obama's election hadn't ended racism, and also blissfully unaware of their own racist sentiments. It would also have predicted that black Americans would generally suffer from fewer such illusions, either about the country or about the white people at the party with them. It would even have predicted the resounding success of a politician who played to white Americans' racist sentiments. What it wouldn't have predicted, however, was that such success could be achieved by openly and brazenly appealing to these racist sentiments. Trump's success was thoroughly at odds with what had seemed to be the well-established predictions of political psychology. Since the Civil Rights Movement, this orthodoxy held. Overt expressions of racism were unacceptable in national political discourse. They would doom a campaign. But Trump ignored all this and did what was supposed to spell the end of a national quest for office. He said blatantly racist things, so blatant that they were readily recognized as such and criticized for it in the mainstream media. From day one of the Trump administration, blatant falsehoods also took on new prominence. There had been plenty of large falsehoods during the campaign, but not like what came after. The side-by-side pictures shown everywhere made it more than clear that the size of Barack Obama's inauguration crowd dwarfed that of Donald Trump's. And yet Trump insisted, and his spokesperson Sean Spicer insisted, that Trump had had the larger crowd. This lie was shocking both for its obviousness and for its pointlessness. It wasn't an important matter, and yet even when caught in the lie, they would not back down. And the obvious lies continued, morphing into support for conspiracy theories even less plausible than Trump's long-time advocacy of the theory that Barack Obama was really born in Kenya. There was the stunning spread of QAnon, a conspiracy which holds that a deep state insider has been putting coded messages on social media about, putting it briefly, a grand conspiracy of Democrats and celebrities abusing children by draining their adrenochrome, among other things, and Donald Trump's secret heroic efforts to end the abuse. And it grew even more shocking as QAnon adherents won Republican primaries and then became congressional representatives. These weren't just falsehoods, but the sort of falsehoods that would previously have ended any careers associated with them. All this, of course, built up to the conspiracy theory holding that Donald Trump really won the 2020 election. This conspiracy theory, and the support that it got from Republican politicians, directly led to the violent assault on the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021, by people carrying Confederate flags and wearing T-shirts with anti-Jewish slogans, an event that dramatically brought together the blatant racism and wild conspiracism. And, of course, all this continues, even though Trump is no longer president. Republicans who deny the stolen election claims become pariahs in their party. These dramatic rises in blatant racism and obvious falsehood are what is sometimes called saying the quiet part loud. It is definitely not the case that the racism was new or that politicians had always been truthful before. The quiet part had always been there, and it had always been deeply damaging and dangerous. And of course, through much of history, the quiet part had been very loud indeed. But something had indeed shifted. The unsayable became sayable. And not only did it fail to ruin careers, it seemed to help them. This matters. Increasingly hateful language is often a precursor to violence and even genocide. As Lynn Tyrrell writes, "The genocide of the Tutsi in Rwanda in 1994 is a cautionary tale for the rest of the world, warning of the ways that one group can be pitted against another through differences entrenched in practices of speech, reference and categorization to the point of murder. Anti-Tutsi speech was a chronic social poisoning that then catalyzed into an acute outbreak of violence." Her work is building on that of Victor Klemperer, a Jewish linguist who chronicled the linguistic changes of the Nazi era and their effects. Nazism permeated the flesh and blood of the people through single words, idioms and sentence structures which were imposed on them in a million repetitions and taken on board mechanically and unconsciously. It is no small thing, then, for previously unacceptable expressions of racism to become ordinary. Normalizing increasingly blatant racism is a dangerous step, one we need to notice, understand and fight. These are key goals of the present book. I am far from the first to ask how the changes of the Trump era happened, but the approach in this book is quite different from others. One of the differences is that I am examining the spread of explicit racism and blatant falsehood together. Most authors have focused on the racism or on the spread of obvious falsehoods, but I think there is much to be gained from looking at the parallels between them. Given that racism is, if defined in terms of claims, basically a collection of falsehoods that should be obvious, this point needs some explaining. Racist falsehoods have a sadly very long history and are well entrenched in widely accepted white supremacist ideologies. There is nothing new about the acceptance of racist falsehoods, nor, tragically, is their falsehood obvious to much of the country, though it should be. Again, white supremacist ideologies are widespread and underpin fervent belief in these falsehoods. As Charles Mills describes it, this is an ignorance propagated at the highest levels of the land, indeed presenting itself unblushingly as knowledge. My focus here, in terms of racism, is on how this already widely accepted racism has come to be so openly expressed. My focus in terms of falsehood is largely on different claims, those that are widely seen as obviously false and ridiculous, such as the QAnon conspiracy theory. Although racist claims should be seen in this way, they are not, due to the entrenchment of racist ideologies. My claim is that similar and connected techniques have led to the rise of openly expressed racism and widespread false and conspiracist beliefs. Examining these together sheds light on both phenomena. Another difference in my approach is that I am not focused primarily on Trump's most ardent supporters, asking how it is that they have come to so fully embrace his blatant racism, or asking what it is that has moved his base to so fervently support wildly implausible conspiracy theories. The most popular answers to these questions invoke either broad features of our current moment, like anti-immigrant sentiment, or particular features attributed to the character of Trump supporters, like a tendency to authoritarian thinking. Instead, this book offers a careful examination of the way that current political rhetoric is simultaneously directed at a variety of different groups in society, and all the complex and interactive ways that this rhetoric affects these groups. Some of these people obviously are committed Trump supporters, but in a way they are the least interesting. It's no surprise that they like what they hear in terms of blatant racism and falsehood. It's much more revealing and important, it seems to me, to look at why other people put up with this, or even support Trump, despite finding it at least somewhat disconcerting. These people are crucial. One reason is that they may themselves be persuaded to become blatant racists and conspiracists. But even if they aren't, they may well be persuaded that the worrying statements are not actually so bad. They may go ahead and support these candidates, or at least fail to oppose them. They might pass on their messages in a spirit of uncertainty, but still pass them on. All of these actions and non-actions are crucial to the rise of blatant racism and wild conspiracism. A primary focus of this book, then, is the rhetoric that allows for the persuasion or reassurance of this malleable group. It does so by achieving a deniability which allows members of this group to convince themselves that deeply held norms against racism and untruthfulness are not being violated, don't apply, and are not so important in this instance. The techniques for achieving deniability with respect to both racism and obvious falsehood have certain key points of similarity that I will explore here. Their similarities lie not just in the way that they lend deniability, but in the ways that they contribute to the pitting of various groups against each other. Properly understanding this requires a careful look at political rhetoric, and that requires a somewhat new approach to philosophy of language. To grapple with it, we must examine the ways that divisions between groups are exploited and enhanced by public speech. Traditionally, analytic philosophers of language have tended to focus either on context-independent elements of language, like linguistic meaning and semantics, or on small face-to-face conversations for those more interested in context and pragmatics. Neither of these approaches is well suited to fully understanding the complexities of public speech designed to exploit divisions among groups, though of course each one provides valuable insights that can be drawn upon in developing a way to think about this sort of political rhetoric. Recently there's been increasing interest in political speech, which is clearly directed at a larger group. However, these two broad approaches have continued to hold sway to a surprising extent, with most theorists focusing either on the workings of particular terms or on power dynamics in ways that are modelled on small group conversations. The sort of manipulative language that is crucial to our current situation, I argue, makes crucial use of divisions among a vast audience. I will argue that the same sort of segmentation of the audience plays a vital role in both the spread of explicit racism and the spread of obvious falsehood. In considering these groups, two key factors will be how the groups respond to the utterances that are made, and how they relate to the social expectations that have in the recent past constrained the expression of explicit racism and obvious falsehood. I will argue that the best way to capture the social expectations which previously constrained speech is to see them as extremely vaguely defined norms, which many, crucially not all, people try to follow. As I formulate them, these are the extremely vague norms captured by the invocations "don't be racist" and "be truthful." The vagueness in formulation allows for individuals to select their own understanding of what these norms require, which is crucial to explaining the many ways that people attempt to circumvent the norms, or to convince themselves and others that they are indeed still following them. These norms, and the flawed ways that they are applied, will play a crucial role throughout this book. I am especially interested, then, in the ways that various groups in the population differ from one another. There are three main groups that will aid in our understanding of the spread of blatant racism and falsehood. Importantly, people do shift between groups from subject to subject and context to context. Someone who opposes the norm against racism, for example, might accept the norm against untruthfulness. Someone who thinks it's acceptable to be racist against one group might think it's not acceptable to be racist against another group. Some violations of norms will be easier to recognize than others, and sometimes this will be affected by one's own group membership and convictions, and people's opinions can, of course, change over time. The first group is the norm opposers. It is probably not a surprise to realize that such people exist in the case of norms against racism. They are the explicit racists, the people who join the Ku Klux Klan and hang out in white supremacist groups online. It may seem a little more puzzling to suppose that there are also people who oppose the norm of truthfulness. But substantial groups of people enjoy the flouting of even this norm, at least under certain circumstances. A recent study, The Appeal of the Lying Demagogue, revealed that when people feel sufficiently aggrieved by the establishment, a person whom they recognize as lying can be appealing precisely for breaking this norm. The second group is the people who accept the relevant norm, but can be relatively easily convinced not to worry too much about it. This may happen in several ways. It may be that a claim can be phrased in such a way that it is not recognized as violating the norm. For some of these people, this may be very easy. They may simply be bad at recognizing violations. For others, this will require more care. Alternatively, a claim can be phrased in such a way that doubt is raised about the violation of a norm. Or, as we will discuss, some additional utterance may provide enough reassurance or raise enough doubt that some of these people refrain from judgment. People of this second group may be persuaded to support politicians who make their racist or false utterances in the right way, or alternatively, they may be persuaded simply not to oppose them so strongly, or to pass their messages on in the spirit of asking questions. The main thing is that these people would be likely to oppose the obvious racist or liar if they recognize them as such, but they can be caused not to recognize them. These people will be a particularly important topic in this book, as the language used in addressing them makes an enormous difference to how they receive the claims that are made. In particular, the use of rhetoric that lends deniability has a substantial effect on these people. The third group is the strong norm supporters, who not only support the norm, but are good at recognizing violations of it. These people are not persuaded by just the right phrasing into doubting whether the utterances in question violate the norms. To them, the violations are obvious. The use of deniable rhetoric is important with respect to this group too. However, members of this group will condemn claims that have been made using deniable rhetoric, but it is more difficult to get uptake for this condemnation, and so the condemnation itself can be used to sow division. As Ian Haney Lopez writes, Trump's racism was audible by design to those in the political know, but not to his supporters. He calculated that he could parlay charges of racism against him into aggrieved outrage among his supporters. Being explicit about these divisions helps us to work through the complexities of some powerful manipulative utterances. We will discuss all this in much more detail in the chapters to come, but an example will illustrate the general form of what we will examine in greater detail later. Consider, for illustration, Trump's call during the 2016 election campaign for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until our country's representatives can figure out what is going on. This is widely and correctly seen as blatantly racist. Blatant racism used to be seen as something that was unacceptable in political speech, yet Trump succeeded. Let's examine how the various groups outlined seem to have reacted. The group that supports anti-racism norms and is good at recognizing their violations recognized this for the racism that it is, condemned it, and considered such a level of racism to mean that Trump was not an acceptable candidate for president. Unsurprisingly, those who oppose the norm against racism may well be very happy to see themselves and those they support as racist. These people are the ones who warmly embrace the thought of a racist candidate and who liked the racism of utterances like this one. The really interesting group, for our purposes, is the one made up of people who would be moved by the very specific way that this utterance is phrased. The end of the utterance is the key here. It is what I call a fig leaf, a bit of speech that provides cover for what might otherwise be easily recognized as racist. The fact that the ban is to be just until we figure out what's going on provides some cover for racism. A racist, some think, would expect whatever the problem is to be a permanent one, not one to be solved by a temporary ban. For this group, the fig leaf may raise just enough doubt about the utterance's racism that they are reassured. The careful phrasing induces the persuadable group to go along with it, or at least to be uncertain about opposing it. But this isn't all that it does. Both the racism and the manipulative utterance fuel the rightful anger of those who strongly support the anti-racism norm. This anger helps to foment division. As fascist leaders have known for some time, making one's followers feel under threat from others is a powerful technique to motivate strong loyalty. The mere fact that some people will make accusations of racism helps to motivate those who have come to support Trump, whether because they are proud racists, because they have been convinced that there is no norm violation, or because they are uncertain about whether there is a violation. The careful phrasing plays a key role here. If the racism is at least somewhat disguised, then some will see the reaction against it as inappropriately judgmental. Opposing this may move them from uncertainty to defensive support for the person who made the racist utterance. This book is very focused on the rhetoric used in public speech that has succeeded in making blatant racism and obvious falsehood a surprisingly effective political strategy. A part of what we will be trying to understand is how individuals may be motivated to support, or at least not oppose, a candidate spouting blatant racism and falsehood. But a crucial part of this project is to reject a strict dichotomy between individualistic and structural approaches. What happens to these individuals is not just a matter of their individual psychology, but a matter of the forces that act upon them in their society and social subgroup. And the results of these effects upon individuals are very much felt as societal and structural levels. When enough individuals become convinced of a conspiracy theory which holds that Donald Trump really won the 2020 election, for example, they may band together to stage an insurrection. And perhaps even more importantly, the widespread belief that the election was stolen serves to underpin efforts to disenfranchise voters of colour on a massive scale. If successful, these moves will enhance the already massive structural barriers against any effort to reduce oppression. Coming up, I summarise the overall shape of the book with a chapter breakdown. 1. White racism, white racial folk theory, and white racial discourse. Chapter 1 provides essential background and scene setting to understand the racial rhetoric that will be explored in chapters 2 and 3. It explores the deeply flawed folk theory that many white people subscribe to about race. This theory allows its subscribers to think of themselves and those they support as not being racist. One part of this theory involves setting a very high bar for what is required to be racist and combining it with lots of excuses for why apparently racist behaviour or speech might not really be racist. This goes hand in hand with a conception of racists as a kind of moral monster to be feared and reviled, but also probably so rare that we would not encounter them much in everyday life. This fits well with the fact that political discourse since the civil rights movement was, until recently, thought to be governed by what Charlie Mendelberg called the norm of racial equality, which rules out open expression of racism. At the same time, however, white people continued to harbour high levels of what psychologists call racial resentment. Politicians who could find a way to appeal to that racial resentment, while not being too obvious about it, have long been able to do very well in US politics. Until the election of 2016, in fact, it was widely believed that a politician openly expressing racist sentiments could not longer succeed on a national scale in US politics. This state of affairs helped to give birth to the sorts of deniability-seeking mechanisms discussed in Chapter 2. 2. Racist dog whistles. Chapter 2 explores one of the most discussed techniques for appealing to racial resentment without running afoul of the norm of racial equality, the dog whistle. The metaphor is derived from special whistles used for dogs, which cannot be heard by humans. The account of dog whistles developed here differs from others in the academic literature by insisting on a bifurcated approach. Racist dog whistles, I argue, come in two main varieties that work very differently. Overt code racist dog whistles work like a secret code, designed to be understood by one group, those who don't accept norms against racism, and not recognized by the others. A paradigm case of this would be codes like 88 to mean Heil Hitler, used by white supremacists on the internet to communicate with each other in such a way as to evade detection by hate speech algorithms. Covert effect racist dog whistles act on some of the people who accept the anti-racism norm without their awareness of this, causing them to base their decisions on racial resentments. One way of doing this, which we will discuss later in the book, is to avoid racial terms but use racialized imagery. We will learn that words like welfare have also been shown to work in this way. Dog whistles are, importantly, also propagated and spread by those who are not aware of what they are doing, who, for example, use an item of white supremacist code without realizing that is what it is. This is a crucial part of the functioning of dog whistles. It helps them to spread, and it also is the foundation for deniability. If one might use a dog whistle innocently, there is so much more plausibility to claiming that this is what one has done. Moreover, disputes over whether something really is a dog whistle both derive from and feed the division that is so central to our discussion. This chapter, then, explores some of the complexities of this deniable mode of communication. 3. Fig leaves for racism. Chapter 3 tackles the pressing and difficult issue of how it is that blatant racism has recently become so much more mainstream in US politics. I argue that a key mechanism is the use of what I call racial fig leaves. Fig leaves as artistic namesake is used by artists to literally cover the body parts one is not supposed to show in public. Racial fig leaves are additional bits of speech which provide metaphorical cover for utterances that would otherwise be seen as clearly racist. These sometimes immediately accompany the racist utterance, as in, "I'm not a racist, but..." And they sometimes appear at a different time, often when a speaker is accused of racism. "But some of my best friends are black" is a classic choice for these times. Fig leaves, of course, are not for everyone. The proud racists are not bothered by the racism, and the strong supporters of anti-racism norms will mostly not be convinced by them. But they can be effective with the middle group, those who don't want to be racist, but can be convinced that the utterance wasn't racist after all, or maybe just come to doubt its racism enough to look the other way. Fig leaves have been particularly important to Donald Trump, who uses them regularly. They even played a role in Trump's announcement of his candidacy, in which he suggested that Mexicans were rapists, but bizarrely added, "and some, I assume, are good people." This strange addition did valuable work for Trump as a fig leaf. Unsurprisingly, white people's immensely flawed understandings of racism play a crucial role in the working of fig leaves, as does the vagueness of the anti-racism norm. Together, these make it very easy for many white people to convince themselves that they and those they care about are not making racist utterances. And even when they do not convince themselves of this, they may succeed in raising just enough doubt that they don't feel the need to abandon a candidate they feel drawn to. This chapter explores the nature of fig leaves in detail, arguing that they are especially important because of their capacity to shift understandings of what counts as racism. 4. The rise of blatant falsehood. In Chapter 4, I turn my attention from blatant racism to blatant falsehood. As already noted, another shocking feature of our present time is the current prevalence of extremely obvious falsehoods in political discourse. These include wildly implausible conspiracy theories of the sort that would previously have ended the political careers of anyone endorsing them. I am far from the first person to attempt to make some sense of this situation, and in Chapter 4 I lay out important features of the ways that my conceptualization differs from others. Once more, a key difference will be my attention to the importance of recognizing different reactions from different groups in the population. I argue, for example, that a claim cannot simply be classified as a bald-faced lie, one so obvious that its utterer knows that they will not be believed. For almost any political claim that we are tempted to call a bald...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?